Alright. Ford struck another match to help him search for a light switch. Monstrous shadows leaped and loomed again. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick with musty smells, which sidled into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. "How did we get here?" he asked, shivering slightly. "We hitched a lift," said Ford. "Excuse me?" said Arthur. "Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumbs and some green, bug-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, 'Hi, fellas, hop right in. I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout.'" "Well," said Ford, "the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signaling device. The roundabout's at Bernard's star 6 light years away, but otherwise there's more or less right." "And the bug-eyed monster?" "It's green, yes." "Fine," said Arthur. "When can I go home?" "You can't," said our Ford Perfect, and found the light switch. "Shade your eyes," he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. "Good grief," said Arthur. "Is this really the interior of a flying saucer?" That's cool. I thought I didn't. So that's a Vogon ship? Sure. Alright. Alright. Prosthetic Vogon Jeltz heaved his unpleasant green body round the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing populated planets. He wished that someone would come and tell him that it was all wrong so that he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto his control seat in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about, but it only gave a complaining sort of creak. "Go away," he shouted at a young Vogon guard who entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately, feeling rather relieved. He was glad it wouldn't now be him who delivered the report they just received. The report was an official release, which was that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was at the moment being unveiled at a government research base here on Damogram, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout because it was the door from the galley quarters where the Dentrastis prepared his meals. A meal would be most welcome. It sounds like, I guess, the Vogons own highways. Oh, the Vogons own the highways, and that's why they're forced to. And that's what's going on Arthur's planet. I bet. A huge furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prosthetic Vogon Jolts was delighted. He knew that when a Dentrasi looked that pleased with itself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship that he could get very angry indeed about. Ford and Arthur stared around them. "Well, what do you think?" said Fred. "It's a bit squalid, isn't it?" Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. "Well, this is a working ship, you see," said Ford. These are the Dentrasi sleeping quarters. I thought you said they were called Vogons or something." "Yes," said Ford. "The Vogons run the ship. The Dentrasis are the cooks. They let us on board." "I'm confused," said Arthur. "Here, have a look at this," said Ford. He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about in his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattresses nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about because all mattresses grown in the swamps of Scornchellis that are very thoroughly killed, and dried before being put to service. Very few have ever come to life again. What? I'm going to reread that real quick. Ford handed the book to Arthur. What is this? Asked Arthur. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job. Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. I like the cover, he said. Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligent thing anybody said to me all day. I'll show you how it works, said Ford. He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it were a two-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover. You press the button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index. A screen about 3 inches by 4 lit up, and characters began to flicker across the surface. I thought that shit was dialogue. You want to know about Vogons? So I entered that name, so... His fingers tapped some more keys. And there we are. The words Vogon Constructor Fleets flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button at the bottom of the screen, and words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well, in a still quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. Vogon Constructor Fleets, here is what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-bladder beast of trawl, which orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, quarried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firefighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down his throat, and the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-bladder beast of trawl. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry at you. Arthur blinked at it. What a strange book. How did we get a lift then? That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to do is include a bit about how the Vogons now employ Dentrasi cooks, which gives us a rather useful little loophole. A pained expression crossed Arthur's face. But who are the Dentrasis, he said. Great guys, said Ford. They're the best cooks and the best drink mixers, and they don't give a wet slap about anything else, and they'll always help a hitchhikers aboard. Partly because they like the company, but mostly because it annoys the Vogons, which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're an impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 Altarian a day. And that's my job. Fun, isn't it? Arthur looked lost. It's amazing, he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses. Unfortunately, I got stuck on the earth for rather longer than I intended for it. I came for a week and got stuck for 15 years. But how did you get there in the first place then? Easy. I got a lift with a teaser. A teaser? Yeah. What is a teaser? Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets that haven't made interstellar contact yet and buzz them. Buzz them? Arthur began to feel that Ford was enjoying making life difficult for him. Yeah, said Ford. They buzz them. They find some isolated spot that with very few people around, then land right by some poor unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe, and then strut up down in front of him, wearingly silent, silly antennas on their head, and making beep-beep noises. Rather childish, really. Ford leaned back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. Ford, insisted Arthur, I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, But what am I doing here? Well, you know that, said Ford. I rescued you from Earth. And what's happened to the Earth? Ah, it's been demolished. Has it, said Arthur levelly. Yes, it just boiled away into space. Look, said Arthur, I'm a bit upset about that. Ford frowned to himself and seemed to roll the thought around his mind. Yes, I can understand that, he said at last. Understand that? Shouted Arthur. Understand that? Ford sprang up. Keep looking at the book, he hissed urgently. What? Don't panic. I'm not panicking. Yes, you are. All right. So I'm panicking. What else is there to do? You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your ear. I beg your pardon? Asked Arthur rather politely, he thought. Ford was holding up a small glass jar which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around in it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp hold of. He would have felt safe if, alongside the mattresses, underwear, the piles of scorn-shelless mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding up a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, he had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes, but he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly, a violent noise leaped at them, from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle while fighting off a pack of wolves. Shush, said Ford. Listen, it might be important. I'm important? It's the Vogon captain making an announcement on the tannoy. You mean that's how the Vogons talk? Listen, but I can't speak Vogon. You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear. Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear. And he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his oral tract. Oh, God. Oh, God. What? Ford, with the lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear. And he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his oral tract. Gasping with horror, he scrambled at his ear for a second or so. He then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the oral equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick, or of looking at a lot of colored dots on a piece of paper, which suddenly resolve themselves into the figure 6, and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles. He knew that only now it had somehow taken on the semblance of a perfectly straightforward English. This is what he heard. That was disgusting.
Chapter 6. Howl, howl, gargle, howl, gargle, howl, 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 gargle, howl, gargle, howl, howl, gargle, gargle, howl, gargle, 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 howl, slurp, should have a good time. Message repeats. This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, wherever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked very hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I have sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we are about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Bernard's star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anybody else should have a good time. Message ends. The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor, with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. "Charming man," he said. "I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one." "You wouldn't need to," said Ford. They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident, so don't move." "No, don't move," he added as Arthur began to uncurl himself. "You better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" "You ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said. "Yeah? What's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a babble fish. Look it up in the book if you like." He tossed over the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The babblefish," said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious metal frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a babble fish in your ear, you can have it instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix, which has been fed into your mind by your babblefish. Now it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing." "But," says man, "the babblefish is the dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so, therefore, by your own arguments, you don't." QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. "Oh, that was easy," says man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white and gets himself killed on the next pedestrian crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingoes' kidneys, but that didn't stop Ulan Khulufid making a small fortune when he used it as the central theme of his best-selling book. Well, that wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor babblefish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he had been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before and felt a sudden stab. So the supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind. Stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He got that somehow. He got it. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He decided to start smaller again. New York has gone. No reaction. He never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There is no longer any such thing, a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came around a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford looked up where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said. If you're a researcher on this book thing, and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it says in this edition then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hands shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Down there. See at the bottom of the screen just above Eccentrica Galumpets? The triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6? Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment, it still didn't register. Then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sakes, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentracis, whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tip boots, said Ford. There was a sharp ringing rap on the door. Then, who is it, said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some poetry of his first. Interesting stuff. I like where this is going. I like the conflict between Ford and what's his name? Arthur, because Arthur is going through an existential crisis. He's going through internal conflicts, and that's really cool, you know. It's relatable. He's going through a space. That's dope. Let's move on.